Okay, lightning talk. I was told I have 15 minutes. I'll try to keep it under for questions if there are any afterwards, but the title of the talk is a little controversial. How to add Dialyzer to an existing Elixir project, the subtitle being Without Your Colleagues Hating You. That's relevant later. Who am I, though? I'm Noah. I go by Nezteb pretty much everywhere. Pro tip, it's my last name backwards. Very creative. I'm a senior software engineer at a company called InCharge.Energy. We build infrastructure for provisioning and managing electric vehicle chargers, mostly for larger fleets, not really residential vehicles quite yet. Some notes before we start. I'm going to be using the terms Dialyzer and Dialixir probably a little interchangeably. Dialixir is just a wrapper around Dialyzer, built by and maintained by a guy named Jeremy. He's very cool, very open to ideas for Dialixir. Another note, we are not going to be talking about the recent addition of incremental Dialyzer in OTP 26. There's a PR or an issue open on the Dialixir repo to add support for that, but that has not been implemented yet. We'll be looking at it in the future. So most people in here are probably more familiar with Erlang than Elixir, and so you're probably thinking, who could possibly dislike Dialyzer? This is like the best tool we have for type checking our language. The answer is there's a few people who dislike it. There was a poll back in 2022 on the Elixir forum about, do you use Dialyzer in your projects? It was rough. It was a little rough. About 30% of people said no. And the majority of the comments were relatively heated about whether or not Dialyzer is a value add overall or not. I created another poll earlier this year saying, instead of saying, do you use Dialyzer or not, I wanted to know, okay, well, if you don't use it, what do you use? So the majority of this poll did vote for Dialixir, aka Dialyzer wrapper. And then there's a lot of good conversations later in this thread about what people use and why. I asked, who could dislike Dialyzer and how? A few people. Chris McCord, creator of Phoenix, says Dialyzer as it exists today is a net negative value add for me. He'll only use it if forced. In principle, it checks out, but in practice, it costs more than it saves. So that's a little controversial to some, maybe. But if anyone, it's relatively trivial to add Dialyzer to a new project and get it set up in your CI and make sure that your types are valid and that that's in your CI and everything works out and you don't add new errors. I was motivated to eventually write a blog post and give this talk by Jesper Eskilsson, who is an engineer at Klarna. He gave a talk last year, I believe, about slaying the type hydra, or how we went from 12,000 Dialyzer errors to none. I saw this talk and thought, ooh, this is something I've seen multiple people in the community have problems with. So this eventually led to me guest writing a blog post on the fly.io blog called Adding Dialyzer Without the Pain. We took out the subtitle about your colleagues hating you for marketing reasons, but this eventually led to a podcast episode. So if you want more details about what I'm talking about, go ahead and check those out. But I figured for a lightning talk, the best way to show off this method that I'm referring to is just let's try it. So I'm going to take a random Elixir project that very few people have probably heard of. Phoenix, they don't use Dialyzer, so I figured let's try adding Dialyzer to Phoenix. Skipping over some of the details like installing it and configuring CI to use it. Hopefully this is legible, but at the top I'm just running mix Dialyzer. I've already got my dependencies and compiled everything. You run mix Dialyzer, you get some info output, and then you see at the bottom total errors 173. That sounds like a lot of errors. Very few people are going to want to sit down and fix all 173 of those errors at once. Luckily, Dialixir has a little tool for us called an ignore file. You can generate it by running mix Dialyzer -- format ignore file, and it'll print out a bunch of key tuple pairs for file name and the atom representing the error itself. For example, we see unknown function happen a lot. This ignore format might seem a little lackluster at first because it's not going to be very granular about the errors it's ignoring. There actually is a PR that I added to kind of tweak this output format so that we can specify it. So instead of ignoring an entire type of errors at the file level, we can now do it at the file and then the description level. So what I mean is, in the latest release of Dialyzer now, you can say mix Dialyzer -- format ignore file strict. And so this, whereas the previous version only created 56 ignore lines to add to an ignore file, this one adds 136. So it's more granular. And when I say adding it to an ignore file, the ignore file looks like this. It's a list with these tuples exactly as they were printed out in the previous slide. You add a .dialyzer ignore file to your project, and now if we run mix Dialyzer, done, passed successfully, no errors, hooray, we can go home, our code is fine, which said nobody. How do we actually fix the errors though? This is a somewhat larger topic. In the blog post, I do link to several Dialyzer resources that I frequently refer back to, 2 blog posts and 2 talks, basically summarizing Dialyzer errors can be a little tricky to figure out, especially if you're new to either Erlang or Elixir. So some of these resources go over it a bit. I particularly like Stavros's talk about what does Dialyzer think of me, where he points out the different types of testing and verification tools and whether or not they're complete and everything that they report is an error versus potentially missing a few. He goes into the concept of success typing as well, which is very valuable for anyone trying to debug Dialyzer errors. In the original blog post that was posted to the Elixir forum, John Hogberg of the Erlang core team actually replied a little bit of constructive feedback that it's worth mentioning that these ignore files are only ignoring the messages. So the errors themselves are still there. They can still contribute to future errors and make it very annoying to debug, because if you're ignoring some of your errors and those errors are causing new ones, you're going to have a bad time. So I don't lay it out in the blog post. We do talk a bit in the podcast episode about it, but I've kind of come up with a strategy for how to deal with this. The main aspect is when you sit down and commit to addressing some of these errors, maybe you're in a large project and you've got a ticketing system, Jira, and you can split out some of the errors and let your team address them over time. So say you want to sit down and solve some errors. You've time-boxed an hour to actually do the thing. The first step I usually will do is unignore all of those lines. So go back to your ignore file, just make this an empty list, save it, rerun Dialyzer, and then start at the top of the list of errors and work your way down. The ones at the bottom oftentimes are related to the ones farther up in the list, although I don't know if that's guaranteed or not. So start at the top, work your way through them in order. If you get stuck, maybe jump to more core user, like things like user or account, things that are lower level in your business domain. Start at those files and modules, fix those, rerun Dialyzer, and just repeat the process. And over time, the number of lines you need to add to your ignore file should be going down. There are docs in the Elixir repo about adding this to your CI and having it report specific errors in different formats. So the docs are very good in that regard. And then when you're done, or mentally drained in the case of Dialyzer errors, just regenerate your ignore files, and over time, they should be reduced in size. The TLDR, adding Dialyzer to a large existing project is difficult. Chris McCord thinks so. So it's not like this is a niche problem that people have. Ignoring the errors while also catching new ones can help, especially if it's integrated into your CI. But it's worth noting, like I mentioned earlier, that ignoring the errors doesn't make them go away. This is essentially a form of tech debt, and we should treat it as such. Don't just generate your ignore file and just let it grow. The goal is to eventually reduce it, get rid of the need for ignoring these errors altogether, and then you can continue from like a clean slate. And as we've talked a bit about in this room today and has been the buzz lately, Elixir's upcoming type system will probably change everything. I don't know how it's going to integrate with Dialyzer or Dialyzer will integrate with it. But in the near future, who knows, I might write a blog post called How to Add Types to an existing Elixir project without your colleagues hating you. Hopefully it's less painful, but I look forward to seeing where we go from here. And this is a joke about me being done. So if there are any questions, or if we have time, started a little early, we're ending a little early, so thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
All right, so not an Elixir specific thing, but a general observation that is the pain point we've had with having configuration files which do error suppression like this, is that it can produce astoundingly difficult to debug problems in itself, in that two people have got exactly the same code base. One of them, it runs successfully in CI, one of it doesn't. And you spend your time tearing your hair out until you discover, oh, we've got different configuration files for error suppression. So I was wondering if that's an issue you've been hitting?
Not usually. There is actually a config option. I don't know what the code is, but I don't need it. There's a configuration option in... Go away. There's a configuration option in Dialyzer that is called, forget what it's called off the top of my head. It essentially says that if there's any ignore lines that actually don't need to be ignored, so example, you fix a type error and then you push it up to CI, the Dialyzer will actually report saying, hey, this line is in your ignore file, but this error isn't present anymore, and it'll fail. Or you can make it fail if you want. You can have it return an exit code. At least at InCharge, that's what we have set up, so that if there's a bunch of people adding new code and some of them are getting type errors, or they're fixing type errors ideally as we go, we can get notified saying, hey, you've fixed some type errors, but there's still lines in the ignore file. So that's the easiest way I found of doing this, is basically saying, ignore these errors, but if we ever fix them, don't let them come back. So it's a hard problem, because if there's, like at Klarna, they had 12,000 errors, and they went through a similar process. They don't, Jesper doesn't go over the specifics of what they did to ignore the errors, but the way of integrating with CI and making sure you're checking in regularly with your team, that like the number of lines is going down. If we accidentally miss any, we'll find out one way or another. Either it'll be in the ignore file, or we'll get an error about it. That's the best way I've found. And so far, again, I haven't actually queried any of my colleagues, but I don't think anyone hates me. So and just as when I first went through this process and added this to InCharge code, we had like 600 errors in multiple services. Doesn't seem too bad. Today we're down to like 350. So we're going down. And every time, and we all understand mostly what each error means and how to fix it. So the process is getting quicker and quicker for us, at least. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thanks.